get started, but before I get started, some ground rules. I would prefer if you guys can take questions towards the end of the talk, because I think I would have answered most of the questions during the talk, most likely. And hopefully I'll try to leave some time towards the end. I'm starting pretty late, and it's a long day. Hopefully I'll be able to leave some time. Okay. So who am I? I'm Saurabh. I come from this part of the world, and I live here. This is my family. This is identity security by obscurity, as you cannot see us very well. This is more personal information than you possibly care. Professionally, if you haven't yet noticed, I work for Symantec. I work at the headquarters, which is in Mountain View. My office is just at the corner of that campus building. I'm an engineer, I'm an architect, researcher, and an innovator. So they couldn't figure out what to call me, so they gave me the title Distinguished Engineer. But in HR, they refer to me as a Senior Technical Director, and entry in the directory. I worked at Symantec for 12 plus years, and if you work at one company for more than 12 years, this is what happens. So what do we do here? We build world-class products, which basically are intended to protect your digital life. This is one of my favorite ads we did a long time ago. Pretty much shows how Symantec products are ubiquitous around consumer as well as enterprise space. So we build products for consumer, for small and medium businesses, for enterprises, as well as we have services and professional services. Our product list goes on and on, which I couldn't fit in even a single slide. But you'll probably recognize us with these flagship products, and many of them which you'll see in shelves, and hopefully you're using them. And if you're not, hopefully by the end of the talk, I'll be convinced that they're good products to use. Okay, so those are the two basically logos. Norton is the consumer brand, whereas Symantec is the enterprise brand. So I work in CTO's office in a group called Security Technologies and Response Group. And there we build engines for the products, where engines are really the core aspect of the product or core technology. So now let's talk about malware. And the reason I would spend some slides, a decent amount of slides talking about malware, because unless I get the context right, you would not be able to appreciate the applications of machine learning and the problems we are trying to solve and what challenges we face. Okay. So origins of malware actually predates me. There was a very good paper by John von Neumann. He actually did the paper in 1949, but it was published in 1966, which was about self-reproducing automata, where he started linking computers with nervous system and how computers could get smart and so on and so forth. It was a very good paper. Inspired by his paper came the first malware, proof of concept in 1971, Creeper, which was also accompanied by Reaper, which was a repair tool for Creeper. And then came Rabbit, which was really the first malware which caused nuisance in the sense that it caused machines to go down and they had to repair. It was resource hogging, self-replicating program on OS 360, and they had to take the machines offline and clean them up. And then you had Morris, and that was just the beginning of the era of viruses. Okay. Then came the fast era of worms, and you had worms like Love Letter, MyDoom, Sasser, Blaster, Sobig, and so on and so forth. Okay. You fast forward now, and now it is no longer about it's no longer about what tricks you have up the sleeve, which is what was happening today. Now it's no more about fun or pain. So if I were to categorize the current threats of the day, there are lots and lots of ways in which you can categorize. I would categorize it in three simple ways. One is the threats which are targeting the consumer. They are basically targeting the money aspect of the consumer. The attacks are really carried out by skilled criminals, by criminal enterprises. The second category would be for threats to the corporations or enterprises, which is all about the data theft, also known as exfiltration. And the theft is about data secrets or business secrets. Okay. And the third category is basically cyber war or cyber terrorism, which is really state-sponsored activity and it is basically targeting the infrastructure. All of these three scenarios, the attacker is extremely motivated and also very well funded. They have ample resources and skills at their disposal. And these are our opponents, okay? But it is not a playing field. They have no rules to follow, okay? But we have to protect you all the time. They have to get it right just once, whereas we have to be right all the time, okay? So it's a never-ending chess game. It's a constant evolution. We enhance the security technologies, they figure out a way to get around it, and the game goes on. So I say security is a journey, not a destination. As I said, there is a constant evolution, and we have to be extremely agile and nimble. So let's go through some of the examples of attacks that take place. So example number one. So for example, you go to a website, okay? Suddenly you'll see a pop-up like this saying your PC is infected, and you need to click OK here to buy a product in order to clean up the infection. So you buy a software, and it goes about doing its job and cleans up 3 infections. Well, so you're now all cleaned up, but lest did you realize that the malware never existed on your machine in the first place. Okay, so it was lying in the first place, you bought a fake product and it cleaned up something that never existed. That's fake security software. Okay. Example number 2 is you visit a website and after a while, you're unable to access your documents anymore. Okay. When you double click on a doc, you get like a legitimate Windows error dialog box saying the doc is corrupted. You start getting toast notifications which says something's broken in your file system, and when you click that toast notification, you're then recommended buying this tool which will fix all your document corruption issues on the system. Okay, so yes, the docs are fixed. Why? Because it was the one to encrypt the files in the first place. Okay, so the malware got onto your machine, it encrypted all your files, put in stubs in the execution path such that when you're double clicking it, you're getting all kinds of error messages. So that was Trojan.extractor. And as you can see, of course, you cannot fix the file without paying them. Okay? So it's hijacking your documents in your most critical aspect of the the computer usage. And unless you pay, you're not going to be able to access your own contents or documents. In example number 3, you go to a website and suddenly your computer is locked. Okay? And it's a very legitimate looking warning message, and it says that your IP address was used to visit the website containing pornography, child pornography, zoophilia, and child abuse, and whatnot. Okay. And you cannot access your machine, you cannot do anything on the machine. And there were instances where they were actually able to control the webcam on your PC, and your photo would appear next to the, so you would really get scared because it's not like it's raining or anything. So the screen is locked. Whether you have other content on your PC or not, I don't think so you'll be in a situation to walk around your office and say, hey, this is the alert that is displaying. Okay, so it's a pretty bad situation to be in. So what do? You pay off the ticket. As I said, you cannot even complain. So in all the above cases, there is a tremendous amount of money that is being made. Okay? The ticket was anywhere between $200 to $500. So just imagine 1 million users, if they can interact, we're talking big money here. That is why I said they're very well funded, they're very well motivated, they're running a business. This is no longer about showing off how smart you are or how easily you can hack Windows machines. So that was the consumer. Now let's talk about enterprises and government, where you must have heard about targeted threats and APTs. APTs stand for Advanced Persistent Threats. We saw a 42% increase in targeted attacks just in last year. And all kinds of sectors of the industry are targeted of this kind of attack. Manufacturing saw close to 24% targeted attacks being focused on that sector alone. And it usually starts off with social engineering, a spear phishing email. Spear phishing email is a very well crafted email message which is going to be targeted towards a particular function, a particular user in our enterprise in order to entice him to be a victim to an attack. So it's tailor-made for the target enterprise or the user. In 2011, the C-level execs were the most common targets. In 2012, it was really R&D which was the most common target. So as I said, tailor-made to the victim, but this one was an interesting one, where it is saying that, hey, here you have a fixed version of the salaries, PDF, I'm sorry about the errors in yesterday's email. This one, I'm pretty sure everybody would click, because it is so exciting to open up, okay? Because we have no idea what others are getting paid. Okay, so user opens an email and the attachment. Well, it exploits a vulnerability in your either a PDF reader or whichever is the application associated with the attachment. And the malware runs. In 2012, we saw close to 5,300 vulnerabilities, undisclosed vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities reported. So you can see how prevalent the vulnerabilities are and how easy it is for the malware to exploit. So once the malware is on your machine, it spreads across other connected machines. Then it goes about searching for the data, right? Because it's really there to steal your secrets. Then it obviously spreads to other machines, collects, and starts exfiltrating the data. So this was a view of the threat landscape with a couple of examples. So how do they increase the chance of success? As I said, they're very motivated and they have a real business to take care of. If you're not running any security software, then it's pretty easy for them. But if you are, then they're of course going to create a malware, and they're going to create a variant of the malware, and they're going to do that over and over again until they can bypass the security software. Okay? And there are tools and software available for them to take advantage of, which will basically facilitate doing this, which are referred to as cryptors and packets. And that's what they do. They take the file and they mutate it at the file level so that the signature can be evaded. So you basically get one malware, and it's thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of variants, trying to just evade the corresponding security software, whichever they want to evade. The attacker then goes about using web attack toolkits, which is again very mature technology by now, very automated, and you can control all your attack points, where they're getting infected and how, and so on and so forth. So they exploit the websites, and then they start spamming you with URLs in emails or Facebook posts just to entice you to click on the email so that you can land on the website where the infection is hosted. Okay? So you could get messages like this, legitimate looking LinkedIn message, but hardly do you know that the link is basically taking it to their infected website. They can get as aggressive as starting to buy user traffic because they want you to land on the website where they have hosted the attack. So this is all part of the business. And we are here to protect you in all these cases. Yes, the OS has improved over so many years, but attacks are getting even more complicated. And they are targeting the user. It's no longer about the application, it's no longer about the operating system, it's all about targeting the user, setting up the attack and the context right. So how do we secure you? Okay? So once upon a time, antivirus signatures ruled. Okay? They were basically fingerprints. They were one-to-one mapping of a malware that we have seen, and we would release a signature so that if the end user's machine happens to have that file, we would go about detecting it and convicting and remediating it. Okay? But because of the population growth or explosion in malware, that's probably not feasible, not practical anymore. So most of the security vendors have gone ahead with something which we refer as heuristics or generic signatures, which is about detecting more than just one malware on the basis of one, no longer referred to as a fingerprint, but more as a definition. Okay? And it could be a little more generic than just having a short rule of the file that you want to remediate on the system. It could be a little more loose in the sense that it will detect the variants of the same malware rather than just detecting one file. So I cannot speak for other vendors, but we use machine learning a lot in all these scenarios. We use classifiers and predictive models, and we have been doing that for many years now. Have we perfected the art? No. Malware detection and machine learning is really made for each other. I really enjoy this field because it's got real world user impact. Okay? So when we are innovating, when we are implementing these things, it's very gratifying to see how we can detect malware and clean up end users' machines and secure them. So a lot of research and innovation goes in, but it's a fast changing landscape, right? The malware is evolving very, very rapidly, very, very quickly because as soon as you implement the security technology, they have to evade it. They have to get around. So models must be accurate, the models must be robust, and models must be tolerant to what we refer to as concept drift, right? Because the underlying space is changing so frequently. So how do we do it? Like any other machine learning application, we start with the data. We have huge repositories of data, files and objects. We also crawl the web. We collect the data from third-party feeds. There's also vendor exchange programs, so security vendors do go about exchanging malware so that they all can maintain a decent level of protection for users across the vendor, all the security vendors. And there is ISV programs. So software vendors can come and submit their software to us so that we can certify them being clean, so that we never go about detecting them by mistake. And we have hundreds of millions of users who, through our products, we have a program called Community Watch, where they submit metadata, anonymized metadata information to the backend. Okay? So we are getting all this data from all across the globe. So I think we have probably the most complete security metadata information in the industry. So examples of the data include things like, how many machines have you seen this file by its cache? Okay. Was it just created, or was there on the machine for a long time on end users' machines? How rapidly has it been spreading across all the users? Because we're seeing the file appear on different users' machines. How quickly has it been spreading? How did it come to this machine? Did it come through one of these browsers? Or did it come through an email? Or did it come through one of the applications which has an undisclosed vulnerability or maybe even a disclosed vulnerability? When and where did we first see the file, both in terms of user base, geolocation, and so on and so forth? How many other files exist on this machine? And how many of the files that exist on these machines are clean versus bad? Okay. And then we look at various file characteristics. Things like internally the file packed or obfuscated, in the sense that it is being mutated in a way such that it is not easily susceptible to reverse engineering or any kind of analysis by security experts. What does it do on the machine? Does it write to the settings? Does it communicate over the network? Does it crash? Does it consume resources? And how often does it run? And who runs it? Who is it? The user? Is it an application? How does it really run on the machine? All this anonymized data is being collected from end users' machines and being submitted to the backend. So we have a massive graph of all this metadata information, which basically links users to URLs to files. Okay? So the task at hand we have is how to classify an unknown object. Okay? The hard part is, what is an acceptable error rate for these classification problems that we are trying to solve? And what is a classification error in our scenario? What is an FP? Basically, an FP is that we are going about convicting a clean piece of software, thinking that it is malicious. What are the implications? They could be pretty catastrophic, right? I mean, if we were to convict an OS component, we are pretty much rendering your system unusable. Well, if we convict a user downloaded software and we have a misclassification on that, that probably is not that grave. I mean, it's bad, but it's not that bad because user can go about restoring a file from quarantine. But it's not like we are rendering this machine unusable. As I said, user can restore the file, but we still have to minimize the error because, as I said, it is all about social engineering. So I don't want to cause an error which will provoke you to go to the quarantine restore and restore the file because you could be a target of social engineering. And you might think that we made a mistake misclassifying the file, whereas we were right, and you were the ones who were being played in the social engineering scenario. Okay? So we want to minimize the errors. So we don't want to give a perception that we do make errors more frequently, and that puts the user in a habit to go about restoring files from quarantine. As I said, social engineering is in play here. So when you're downloading Adobe Reader, for example, do you know for sure that it is the real Adobe Reader, or is it like a Trojanized version of Adobe Reader, right? That is, because malware is trying to hide itself in all kinds of trusted forms. So what is an FN? FN is basically we let the malware go, we give it a clean bill of health. Okay? What does that mean? We let it run on the end user's machine, which takes over your machine, causes user dissatisfaction, user distrust, loss of business, because he's going to make customer support calls, and those cost us real money. In fact, even the fact that you're dissatisfied is going to make you not renew the product, not buy, not recommend, and so on and so forth. So it's the classification error in both the cases is resulting in a real tangible loss. Okay? Most malware, once they are allowed to run on the machine, they basically interfere with the security software. Users have to go through a lot of pain to restore and clean up the machine. Of course, there are repair tools which you can download and clean up the machine, but it's a chance. You can always restore from the backup, or in the worst case scenario, you're going to reinstall the operating system. Okay? So you can recover the OS, but what about the data? That was the more important part, and if somehow the malware got to your data, then you're host. So FPs or FNs both are horrible. Hence, when we are building our predictive models, we are extremely conservative about what is an acceptable error rate. Okay? And our view of errors is kind of different than view of errors for most of the industries because we care about the user population impact. Okay? What I mean by population impact is an FP on real Adobe Reader. The question to you all is it one FP or is it millions of FPs because Adobe Reader happens to be on millions of machines? Okay? So from a classifier point of view, we might have a very, very low FP rate, but if we end up calling a really, really popular file as malicious, then it's the worst possible FP, right? So maybe one FP for a classifier, but FP for almost all users, okay? So the error rate has to be minimized for file prevalence, and how do you really factor that kind of situation into your models? So now let's look at the applications of machine learning. We have definitely not seen every file on the end user's machines in the world. We have not seen every URL in the world, okay? So now when the user goes about searching a topic in any kind of search engine, the question is, are all the search results safe? Okay? According to one of the studies that we did, or research that we did, up to 25% of the links that show up in the first page of the search results could be malicious. Okay? So 25% of the search results could be malicious on the first page itself. And then, there are things referred to as watering hole attacks. And basically what they do is, in order to carry out a very targeted attack, they basically want to profile an end user or a set of end users, look at all the websites that they tend to visit, specifically look for vulnerabilities in those websites, host their exploit on those websites so that they can infect the users as early as or as soon as possible. So when you're looking at a search result, the question, the help that we have to offer to the user is this link safe or not? Okay. So here's where we apply our machine learning in order to predict a URL as being safe or not. Okay. And we haven't seen this URL before, so we are trying to make a real-time prediction. Some of the examples of features that we take into account when trying to predict a URL as safe or not are things like how long has a site been around, if we can collect that kind of information. What is the structure of the URL? What is the category of the URL? And again, to come up with a category of the URL, we use machine learning to categorize them, which has its own application in another feature, which is the parental control feature in our product, where kids are blocked from going to bad sites. Okay, so categorization in itself is machine learning driven, and categorization is a feature for another application of machine learning. Then we have a product or a technology, it's basically free, called Norton Connect Safe. It's a.
You might take some questions, or you want to wait?
I would prefer to wait for it. Yeah. Sorry. And it's basically a free DNS service, which is basically classifying DNS as being safe or not, or in terms of content, whether it has adult content, non-adult content, and so on and so forth. And you can basically switch your router to using Norton DNS anytime. It's a free service. It basically classifies domains, and it protects all your internet-connected devices. So it's no longer just about the PC, your Xbox, your iPad, everything is secure because you're basically controlling the security at the DNS level at the router. So let's assume that you ignore all the warnings that we've given you about the URL being unsafe, and you still go ahead and decide to click. So you land on a page, it has a whole bunch of input fields. Page is a form. So now the question is, should you fill up the form or not, right? It's asking for a whole bunch of personal information. The two kind of problems that we face in the sites which are trying to ask personal information is they could be either a phishing or a scam. Okay, these are two similar but very different classification problems. Phishing targets your association with your trusted site. So you bank with Bank of America. Phishing is about tricking you to think that you're going to a Bank of America website, but it's really not a Bank of America website. They want you to give away your username and password to Bank of America, so they're going to make a page look like Bank of America, but it's really not Bank of America. Okay? So that's phishing. It's basically exploiting a trusted relationship between the user and the website. But the scam is really targeting you. It's more about tricking you into a good deal, which is too good to be true, and you're going to give away your, hopefully not social security, but they're looking for a credit card number, a phone number, age, and so on. Okay. But if you're the very first user to the site, should you or should you not disclose your PII? Maybe that is a good enough indicator to warn the user that, hey, across millions and millions of users that we have, you're the first one to visit the site, so now do you really want to disclose your personal information? Okay? So that's the Scam Insight technology, which also uses machine learning and classification in order to warn and block the users from going to these websites. Okay? And it uses, again, features like where is the site hosted, Of course, whether it is HTTP or HTTPS, and even today, I'm surprised how many people are willing to give away their credit card information on HTTP URLs. So, again, we have to take all those features into account in order to warn the user, protect the user. There could be a page with misspelled brand name, right? Now, is that a feature for phish or scam? We tend to treat that more as a feature of phishing rather than scam, because scam, again, is targeting a completely different brand. In fact, they are coming up with a different brand. So, moving on, the site, if it is not a form, then it might have a program or an application, okay? So, again, the help that we have to offer the user is, should you download and run the file from this website, okay? You may not choose to download the file, but it might simply exploit a vulnerability in your browser and slip the application to your machine silently without any user involvement, which is referred to as drive-by download, okay? So no matter how it came, whether the user went and deliberately downloaded or whether the file slipped onto the machine, the question is, should it be allowed to run on the machine or not, okay? So the classification of files at rest is really the problem here. It has not yet run, so we do not know anything about it. We may have its signature or its fingerprint in our definition set, and we might be able to block and convict, but most likely the scenario is that we don't know anything about the file and it is coming down to your machine. So if we have never seen the file before and it hasn't run yet, how are we supposed to classify it? So what are the kind of features that we use in such a classification problem? There are different sets of features. One of them I refer to as contextual features, and which we derive from the graph that I shown a few slides ago, which was all about how many millions of users have been to which all sites and what all files do they have. So this is referred to as the reputation or file population based feature set. Okay. And the second set of features is really structural features, which is all about the PE file itself or the file that we have downloaded. Okay. So the PE structure. PE refers to a portable executable, the application which basically came on your machine. And then there are crowdsourcing features, which is again, how many users have this file and when and how did they get it, so on and so forth. How many machines has this file? How old is this file across all the users that we have? What kind of users have this file? So this was a very innovative concept that we came up with, where instead of worrying anything about the file itself, we were looking at how the file appears across all the users. Some users have a higher propensity to get infected, and some users have lower propensity to get infected. So if a completely unknown file comes on an end user's machine, but it may be the new or an unknown to this user's machine, but mostly in the user population, we have seen it across lots of users who tend to get infected more, then guilt by association, I'm going to think that this file is more likely to be bad, because you know what, across the entire user population, I'm seeing this file across users who tend to get infected more. Similarly, if I see a file on this user's machine, which I have more often seen appear on clean machines than on not so clean machines, then I'm going to give it benefit of doubt and say this file is likely to be clean because users with good hygiene tend to encounter this file. And this has been extremely valuable technology, and completely taken away from the notion of having to worry about the file itself. Okay? So again, it is all about propensity of the user to get infected. As I said, a file which is more likely to appear on infected machines will get the verdict of being malicious. A file which appears on clean machines will get the verdict of being likely clean. If you have seen the file across non-category of the users, I mean, this is completely new first time on this machine, then again, I think you're going to give it a thumbs down because you're the only person in the entire user population to get this file. Most likely it's a polymorphic malware, if not a custom game that has been written for you. So what if you're the first one? Again, as I said, the challenge is it a customized software for you or is it a Trojanized malware? Okay? And we can't afford to get wrong in the customized software case either because the users don't get fit. So there are two scenarios. Okay? The file just arrived and we have all the context about how the file came on the machine. Okay? This is where we have our download insight technology, which I talked about in terms of features and so on and so forth. Does two things. It gives a classification score or a reputation score for files as well as the URLs. Okay? If the file already existed on the machine, then of course we don't have any context. So okay, we have no idea how it came on the machine and so on and so forth. In such cases, we are trying to classify the file on the basis of the structural makeup of the file itself. Okay? If the file is likely bad or suspicious, of course, we're going to convict and remediate and clean up the machine. But if it is likely clean, then it gets a clean bill of health, and the file is allowed to run on a machine. Okay? But now the program has started running, and it has bypassed all our security layers. We warned the user about the URL. User still went ahead and clicked it. If the file came down on the machine, we classified the file. If it was badly remediated, if it was good, it was allowed to run. But now it is going about doing some kind of behaviors. So now if it wants to communicate over the network, the question is should be allow or deny. It creates more files. The question is should be allow or deny. Right? It's going about doing activities on the machine which are making it look more and more suspicious. It's making critical system changes to the operating system so that it can persist and run over and over again, should be allow or deny. So in all these cases, a classifier is going about making real-time decisions to allow an action to take place on the end user's machine or not, while maintaining good user experience. So that's kind of a very, very critical aspect of using a classification approach here, because not only do we have to come up with the features in the context of the event that is happening, and we are doing this in the kernel mode, and we have to evaluate a classifier, and yet you are busy chatting on webcam and you don't want any kind of interference or slowdown. Okay? So we have to make use of all these technologies and do all these tasks while ensuring that the user experience remains optimal. And here the classifiers are basically predicting an action being malicious or not. Okay? So this is our behavioral technology, behavioral security technology. And the key value proposition of this technology really is that it's easy for the file to mutate at the file level itself, right? As I said, hackers and cryptors, they'll try to modify the file so that the hash or the fingerprint that we have the file does not match so that they can run. But they really are not mutating the behavior, right? If it has to write to a registry, it has to write to a registry. They really don't have any choice. If it has to create more PE files, then it has to create more PE files. I mean, otherwise, it's not going to be able to do its purpose. So the classifier is basically trained on the behaviors, okay? And the most challenging part there is extracting behaviors from files, both in terms of good and bad. So you have to run the good files in an automated environment, you have to run the bad samples in an automated environment, extract the behaviors, okay? But again, I just can't take any malware.exe and run it from C drive. You know why? Because malware doesn't run from C drive. It needs the right path, it needs the right command line parameters, it needs the right dependencies. Okay? So automating a piece of software to run is not, is not trivial. On top of it, the software might involve user interaction. It might require the user to click here and there, and unless you click here and there, it's not going to exhibit any behavior. So in order for our classifier to be able to be trained on behaviors, we have to extract the full extent of the behavior of the software, bypass, overcome all these hurdles in order to put it in a data set so that we can go about training a classifier. And malware does know that security vendors are trying to do this in an automated environment, so they have built in automation evasion. They are checking for environmental characteristics that say, is this an automated environment, or am I really running on an end user's machine, so that should I or should I not show my malicious behavior? But guess what? Even good software do not want to be automated in a virtualized environment. So now the question becomes, is the software which is trying to prevent its execution in a virtualized environment, is it trying to protect its IP, or is it malware trying to hide its malicious behavior, right? So, it's not easy either way. In any case, behavioral security is a key asset. Some think of it as the last line of defense because it has gone through a whole bunch of security layers and it is now running, and if you let it run, it's like game over. But really not. There are other technologies still in play, right? I mean, if it is running and it is creating more PE files or more files on the system, well, those files are subject to our file security technology, which again has the context and the file structure to make its own prediction or classification. And network security is still monitoring the traffic that is originating from this piece of malware. And if there is enough evidence across all these technologies, then we still have the right to go about convicting and remediating the file. Okay? So there's a whole bunch of collaboration that happens across all these technologies. Each of them is trying to make make a classification or a prediction that the thing is good or bad. And guess what? We kind of get an ensemble effect, right? The file technology said it is likely bad, and then the behavioral technology said it's likely bad, and the network technology said it's likely bad. So, if there are enough indicators of the fact that the file is bad, then guess what? We are going to take the action and we're going to all these and many more scenarios involve machine learning, and I haven't really gone through each and every scenario, but kind of given you a taste of where we apply machine learning. It's built on huge amounts of data, but is it really a big data? I think big data is a very hyped word, right? I mean, it is up to your interpretation how you want to use it, and what you make of big data. For me, the reason I kind of relate this to big data is because I'm just dealing with a large volume of data, both in terms of trying to build a classifier as well as trying to evaluate. We have 120 million machines which are participating in the Community Watch program, which are submitting anonymized metadata information, and this is coming in at a very fast pace. There are these 120 million machines are generating 700 billion elements of metadata information. We are seeing 2 billion website clicks per day, which are translated into 1.7 trillion rows in our database. And we are trying to come up with a very high confidence predictions for close to 6.3 billion files and 25 billion sites and so on and so forth. So for me, that's big enough to call it big data. Okay? But again, it does fit into the traditional definitions of big data. The data is continuous, and it is coming from hundreds of millions of users. It is from lots of sources, some of them internal, some of them external. The data could be structured or it could be unstructured. So, it does fit in the definition of big data application. And if all this wasn't hard already, then here's the most challenging part. What's the big deal if we have lots of data, right? What's the big deal if we have lots of real-time data? And what's the big deal if we have lots of real-time streaming data? The real challenge is how much of it is labeled versus unlabeled, right? Because you're trying to build the classifier on top of labeled data and apply it to the unlabeled set. What percentage of this data should be labeled that is good enough to come up with a classifier that is reliable enough to apply on the unlabeled data set? You could say apply sampling, but do we really know what the distribution of the data set is so as to apply the right sampling strategy? We haven't been able to figure that out, by the way. So we use labeled data to build classifiers, but the problem is, how is it really doing in the field? Okay? How is it making, so when it is making real-time decisions about a file being good or bad, a URL being good or bad, a behavior or an event being good or bad, we have to monitor the error rates, okay? But we are trying to monitor the error rates on unlabeled data. What does that really mean? I mean, if you don't know it is good, how do you really measure the error rate? So we have to, of course, loop in experts, right? So experts have to validate our classifications that are going on in the field. And the security analysts are basically coming to the assistance here, where they are looking at real-time decisions being made and trying to understand whether all the predictive modeling approaches that we have applied and classifications that are going in the field are they tending towards low error or high error. And what really comes to our rescue in almost all these scenarios is domain expertise, right? Because without domain expertise, no matter what kind of science you apply, this problem isn't trivial. And then we are dealing with a lot of volume of data, to which we really can't scale our experts, right? I mean, even if if I were to say that 10% of the data set is labeled, 90% of the data translates into such huge volumes that I don't think so we can employ those many security analysts or architects to analyze the incoming stream in order to say how we are doing in the field. So here again, we apply machine learning in order to build automation around trying to tie machine expertise with domain expertise. Okay, so here we apply semi-supervised or unsupervised machine learning, and specifically what I mean is clustering. So clustering basically helps identify new patterns. It helps identify new trends, so that we can make the right use of the analyst skill set. Analysts are expensive; they are really skilled, and you want to focus them on distinct sets of problems. I don't want to keep giving them 1,000 files, which is just different at the file level, but it's really the same malware, right? It's going to be really, really irritating and not a good use of their time, because guess what? They're going to look at one file, reverse engineer, run or whatever they want to do, conclude that it is malicious. And they're going to go through a lot of pain process to get hands-on a variant of the same malware, only to realize after wasted 15-20 minutes, hey, this is exactly the same malware, it just was different at the file level. Okay? So we want to avoid that kind of friction and want to make sure that they're focusing on groups of data sets which are uniquely identifying pieces of malware or groups of malware. Okay? So the problem with clustering algorithms, if you are applying or using, is of scale and speed, right? Threats are evolving at really, really fast speed, and I can't really wait for a clustering algorithm iteration to finish after 7 days, because you know what, the unlabeled data set had identified or did contain a lot of samples from a completely new threat, and we have been sitting twiddling our thumbs for 7 days for the clustering to finish, only to realize that there was a new threat trend, right? So we cannot afford to wait that long. So here we are basically combining the making a balanced use of both the analysts and the models. But we have solved that problem. We are able to classify and cluster samples at a very efficient rate. But here's another twist, or here's another challenge. When it comes to combining an analyst with a machine learning clustering-like approach, whom are you going to trust more? Is it the clustering or is it the analyst? Because malware is not black or white. It is varying grades of shade, varying shades of gray. What I mean by that is adware good or bad, right? If you're in the business of collecting coupons and hunting for deals, adware is good. If you get annoyed by toaster pop-ups and ad offers and so on and so forth, adware is bad. So we could have created a classifier which is calling an adware as bad. Analyst is saying this is good. I don't think so. It's a machine learning error. It's just a disagreement between the user and the model. But then how do you factor that back into your machine learning application, right? You start, how do you identify all the adware that has made its way into the ground truth set so that you don't get influenced by adware being called as malicious in your ground truth? So we always run into this situation where you have an analyst opinion differing from a classification error. So here are the last few details. The process and techniques that we use are pretty standard. We build a good ground truth, but then, as I try to explain, what is really a good ground truth? From an ML point of view, of course, it has to be balanced. But the problem for us is different malware samples or families have different, different family sizes or different sample sizes. Okay. One malware family might have 1,000 samples. Another malware family, which happens to be very, very prevalent, happens to exploit a very good vulnerability, gets spread very quickly, might have millions, right? So you run into a problem when trying to build a balanced data set that you have overrepresentation from one family, underrepresentation from other family. In fact, you wanted to get good at detecting the one which is underrepresented, because that's where lies the value of predicting a file to be malware of that category. So again, you could apply sampling, but as I said, I really don't know what the distribution is and what is the right sampling strategy. And not to mention, everybody faces this. There is error in ground truth, right? No ground truth is perfect. If anybody tells you it is, then don't listen. Ground truth has its own problems everywhere. Our data sets are both wide and tall depending on the application that we're talking about. A typical example could be around 100 million rows with across, with around 500 features. So that's our breadth and width and depth. Features are of all kinds. They are continuous, discrete, and booleans. So by that, you have to do a whole bunch of transformations of data before you can apply a corresponding machine learning algorithm, because not all data types are applicable to all classification approaches. Features are often interdependent, and this is another challenge for us. They're not correlated; they're interdependent, and it's a key difference. Because what I mean by that is, there might be two features. This feature is only valid when this feature is valid, or its values make sense when this feature has some value. Whereas correlation, on the other hand, means there's a positive and negative correlation. They both rise and fall together in values. So that's different. So many of our features fall into the interdependent category. So we spend a lot of time in preparing the data and analyzing the data. We do produce a whole bunch of data set reports. We look at the distribution. We look at statistical properties of the data set. We do a whole bunch of correlation analysis, things you might find very familiar through your class. we do feature ranking in order to understand how new features are performing with regards to the older features that we have been working with. That gives us a good idea when we are trying to use a new feature that it is likely to have a positive impact, or should we or should we not use it? Because at the end of the day, too many features start becoming a problem in itself. We do a whole bunch of density plotting and figuring out how's the population distribution looking like across all these features. Again, outlier detection, min-max evaluation. These are all routine but very, very important steps in trying to decide on a classifier and so on and so forth, because in short summaries like this, we see a value which is like a min, but doesn't really make sense for that feature. You can spot an error in the data set and stop your cycle going forward. Otherwise, you can go blind, take the data, it's all numbers, put it into a modeling application, and you get a model, but then it doesn't do what you're expecting because there were problems in the data set. So once we have been through a data set analysis and we have made sure that everything is good about it, the question is which classifier. And this involves a whole bunch of experimentation. Everything is fair game. You could take linear regression, neural nets, SVMs, decision trees, and so on and so forth. Depends on which is the winning approach for that data set and for that application. Once you have selected, you have to test the candidate classifier. Of course, testing on training data doesn't make sense. Testing on code offset, which by the way is another. I get so surprised by this fact in the industry that people talk about classification error rates and they're testing on the training data itself. Like, it doesn't make sense, but they do it all the time, and that's what they report. Anyway, so the other problem we have with setting aside a holdout set is that our features are time dependent. Okay, so you have to make sure that when you are setting out a holdout set, that you have a good enough representation across time dependent features. Otherwise, you just can't say 10%, 90%, right, or 60, 70, because you have to make sure that you have good enough representation of and the behavior of the features in your holdout set. So once we have trained the classifier, of course, it goes through the same process, which many of you in the space might be familiar with. You plot an ROC curve, look at the TP-FP rate, choose an ROC point on the ROC, and that gives you a good acceptable FP rate. Then that's the TP rate you're going to go with. I don't think so. And that's another difference between theory and practice, right? Practice is all about acceptable FP rate. They're not after TP rate because we want to avoid errors. So if our upper bound is 0.5% FP rate, then you have to maximize the TP rate at 0.5% FP rate. It's not about, hey, let's go for 90% TP rate, even if that gives us 2% or 3%. That probably starts going into the unacceptable range. And then we have to measure the classifier for stability. As I said, the threat landscape is changing so fast, you don't want to have a classifier which does extremely well in the first 5 days in the field, and from 6th day onwards, it's basically got no efficacy output. Okay? So testing a classifier stability is another important part of the testing. And then you select the one which is optimal. Yes, we do use R, but we use R mostly in the data set analysis and in research and experimentation phase. But we really use native interpretation of the classifiers in production. It has nothing to do with suitable or unsuitable. It's just that we are transitioning over, and this is our comfort zone. So to recap all the process, we build the data set, we analyze the data set, we create the models, we test, measure, and analyze, and we release, and we celebrate. But then we wait and monitor for the quality of the decisions that are being made in the field, and then we are on to the next iteration, where we are open to, depending on the research that has gone so far, new techniques, new approaches. Somebody has a new feature idea, new classification idea. Everything is fair game. Bring it on, because it's going to go through the same comparative analysis of which classification approach or which feature gives the best bang for the buck, and outputs our products. So winning strategies are nothing but whichever classifier performs the best. The secret of success in all this is the real combination of machine learning skills with domain expertise, because you can put both of them in separate rooms and you get nothing. Machine learning experts on their own will not be able to crack the problem because they don't understand the features. Domain experts have nothing idea about how the machine learning would be able to use the features and come up with the right models and so on and so forth. So the combination of the two really has what has shown the best returns in terms of success in the technology. And of course, there's I don't want to underestimate or downplay the huge amount of work that goes in good feature engineering. So this is what we do and how we do. If it sounds fun, that's my job, and we are hiring. Okay. So I'm open to take questions, but in some cases I may not be able to answer the question, and if your question is trying to poke into some secret sauce or abilities that we use for features. Go ahead.
When you said native implementation, so
Like C, C++.
okay, and are you writing your own libraries as well?
Yes.
In general, can you repeat the questions just to help the audience here?
So the question was, when I said native implementation, what I meant was C and C++ implementation. We just haven't taken R to the production environment. We're in the process.
Do you see a lot of attacks on Macs?
Yes, we do see a lot of attacks on the Mac. So the question was, do you see a lot of attack on the Macs? Look, attacks, as I said, it's all a business. If there's a huge shift of user population towards Mac, yes, Mac are a target candidate. So yes, we do see a lot of attacks on the Mac. But then I didn't mention this, but I have a free giveaway, so a good question does get. Are you a Mac user?
Yeah.
Okay, so you get it. What about you? Oh, you're a Mac user. I only have 10 copies. All right.
So how long does it take for when you have the data, then doing the analysis and creating a model and deploying it in production? What's your window?
So the window, I'll be honest, varies from application to application. There are some applications which take embarrassingly up to 6 months to do the data set analysis because we are extremely FP conservative. Right? We cannot afford to release. I mean, the data set analysis, building a modifier, building a classifier, testing all that gets done in anywhere between 20 days to 30 days. But the error rate is high. The TP rate is no better than what we have already got in the field. It's not really picking up new classes of malware. So what's the point of deploying this? Because you're going to get new sets of headache. Right? If its error rate is on a different class of files, it's going to be a problem. So in some cases, it's just keep more features, different technique. More features, different technique. Does it get any better? So that is probably the longest window. There are other areas in which within a month we are able to, all the way from exporting the data into a data set, doing the data set analysis, building the classifier, evaluating, and shipping it out the door, 30 days. It gets quicker in some cases though. Yeah. Sorry. Windows or Windows? Okay.
So what's the lifetime of a kind of a classifier particular data set? How many times you have to revise the dimensions of your classifier and stuff like that?
So it depends on how robust the classifier was and is as we are measuring the efficacy of the in-field classifications that it's doing. You would be surprised that in certain areas of technology, we never pull back the classifier. We keep shipping new and new classifier, and it just is yet another classifier on top of an existing classifier. So it becomes an ensemble on the endpoint itself. If performance is not an issue, and we have put a lot of effort, a lot of engineering into making sure the models are very efficient to load, very compact. So adding a new classifier is model to the endpoint really isn't a problem.
Is it sort of downloaded on a periodic basis, or is it as needed, or once a year?
So the product does something called rapid updates, which happens every 6 minutes. But we are not releasing classifier every 6 minutes. We are releasing classifiers probably, as I said, around 3 months to 6 months. In some cases, it's just an additive classifier on top of existing. In some cases, we are switching a classifier. Yeah.
Essentially what you're saying, there is a certain kind of dimensional sensitivity in all classifiers. Right? So after some time you find that some dimensions are really not happy with it.
So there are two cases in which we would expedite shipping a new classifier. One in which we are seeing a sudden increase in the misclassification. Okay, so it's showing up more errors, and our analysts are busy fixing the errors on end users' machines. And so there we have to really rush a new classifier. And the other, which is not a serious problem, which is a decay, right? The classifier is no longer able to detect threats of the new type because they never made it to the ground truth set in the first place. So it depends on the application of machine learning that do we want to ship a new classifier. And by the way, addressing a new threat may not always require a new feature. Just the fact that you didn't get that represented in your ground truth set, but now since you have a more recent ground truth set, exactly the same set of features might be very effective at detecting the new threat family. So it's not always about. And even now, it doesn't matter. All right, guys, it's not about giving the software. So I'm take other questions. All right, go ahead.
You mentioned that you have 6 billion files, but there's only 100 million rows in your database, so
6 billion.
how do you go from the 6 billion to 100 million?
So it's like ground truth set is about incorporating a representation from your entire data set on which you have high confidence on the labels, right? We have lots of files, but if we knew everything about every file that was good or bad, we wouldn't be building classifiers, right? We would be rolling out a generic signature which can catch a variety, but we don't know about these files. We have all these files. We cannot use analysts to go and look at all the 6 billion files. Only a small portion of them do we reliably and confidently know that these are good or bad. So we're building a classifier on what percentage of the files we know what the label is.
So you know about those 100 million rows are labeled?
By the way, I didn't say those 100 million rows correspond to files. Okay?
Okay.
I said that was an example of a data set. It could very well be a behavioral classifier where a same sample could show lots and lots of varieties of behaviors, in which case each row becomes a behavior from a same file.
Okay, so there's no one-to-one map.
It depends on the application. Is it a behavioral classification problem or a file classification problem?
Thank you.
So question on, 2 questions on
Sorry.
your,
It doesn't matter. It does. Okay. I'm running out of time.
2 questions.
Sorry.
You got it.
Oh, yeah. All right.
So you said that the process of automated classification is based on some real-time data, and you indicated data that you get from 120 million users and a bunch of servers, etc. Do you get any data from real-time traffic that you're monitoring in a service provider or your enterprise, or something that happens right on the dot instead of waiting for somebody to report that to you?
So it is real-time in the sense that you as a user are downloading a file. The product is querying the backend to figure out whether the file is good or bad. You're making real-time decisions in the backend for you and responding to that the file is good or bad with a varying degree of confidence. The endpoint then takes that information into account and makes a decision whether this is good or bad. That information then persists on the endpoint, and then other technologies kick in and they make their own predictions, and it gets corroborated with the information that backend responded with.
Okay, so you're referring to real-time in the sense that when a particular file is being downloaded, you make a real-time
Yeah.
inquiry into a central semantic server, for example. The second thing is you talked about a behavioral study
Yeah.
to make a classification. Is that behavior based on a behavior you see at a global internet level or a service provider level? Or are you referring to that?
What does the
behavior
sample
at
do on an
end user level?
End user level? Because we are trying to make a decision on your machine when a sample is trying to do a socket communication, right? Should it or should it not be allowed? Because you know what? It might be exfiltrating your tax documents for all you know. So we have to make a decision, real-time decision on the endpoint. So we have to take the behavior, the context, all the information we can possibly get about that sample, and real-time make a decision to allow or not allow. And we have to make it really quick because you're not going to wait, you know, with a wait cursor for us to make a decision.
So I can imagine you're making real-time calls about files and
Yeah.
URLs.
Yeah. So this is all happening in kernel.
But from a behavioral perspective, what would you learn from one user different from the other user?
So not all PCs are same. The samples behave differently on different machines. Depends on the environment of the machine. we could see a variety of behavior for the same sample across different users.
Can you give an example?
Windows 7 versus Windows XP, the malware might behave completely differently. In one case, XP, most users are running as admin. The sample will be able to quickly do whatever it wants to do, no problem. In case of Windows 7, Windows 8, the user is most likely not running. The infection vectors are going to be different, where it persists is going to be different. Same sample, completely different behavior.
But I would consider that as OS specific, not end user specific behavior.
You would consider that as what?
If OS specific
OS?
behavior rather than end user specific behavior.
Yeah, you could consider that. I mean, this is one example. There are lots of other examples like dependencies on other applications. Some malware checks for a specific version of Adobe Reader on the machine, right? So you get into all these complications where, you know, exactly same machine profile. You have Adobe Reader 7, I have Adobe Reader 9. Malware will behave differently on my machine, will not do anything on your machine. Go ahead.
What's, yes, I understand your disclaimer of not disclosing everything publicly. What's the kind of accuracy level that you target in your model?
So again, it depends on the technology because the FP tolerance is different at different points. We shoot for accuracies close to 95%. TP rate being close to 98% in some cases, and FP rate hovering below 1%. Again, it depends, right? So if it is about files, we are extremely conservative because that classifier will run in all kinds of scenarios. We'll be running on gateways, we'll be running on Unix machines trying to classify Windows files because it is a file share server. There may not be any context, we have very little information, so we can't afford to do FPs. And in fact, at a file level, an FP is pretty bad because you just take out a file, and if it is an operating system component, as I said, your machine has those. So tolerance differs. Go ahead.
On the data side, with your 6 billion rows or 100 million row databases, etc., can you talk a little about the data technologies that you use? Is it all SQL or something else?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just be very honest about what I can. I cannot share what database we use, but it is a SQL-driven database.
Okay.
All the data is in a database. It's all structured data. For me, when it comes, it's structured data. I don't have to deal with the mess of how it got there. There are loaders which are loading the data, and it's very efficient at loading the data. I get a dump of the data set, and I go from there. There's a pretty robust, scalable platform that we have, which is able to load the stream of data that is coming in, yeah.
And it's just general characteristics. I mean, is it an in-memory database?
No, it's not an in-memory
It's not.
database.
Okay.
It's not common.
Yeah, now you start asking vendor names. So there's
Too many questions.
You talked about feature engineering and feature engineering. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What's good?
Yeah,
feature
I mean,
engineering?
a classic example of feature engineering problem would be things like if you employed something like a decision tree and you overtrain the classifier, and you're not able to distinguish between the two target classes of good or bad, then you know that you're lacking a feature. And you can pretty much go after the data set that corresponds to that node and say, what interesting features can I mine from this set in order to help the classifier be able to do a clean classification. Right? So that's an example of feature engineering that we do. That's purely machine learning oriented. But as I said, without domain expertise, nothing works, right? So the analysts have to come into play, or somebody who understands the space better and can mine the features. They understand the threats, and they're looking for specific things about the threat which might be very relevant to the feature, to the data set that we have, and be able to come. And then it also depends on a completely new threat that might be propagating out there. Just might have, for example, a new packer it might have used, or a custom packer. It might have some characteristics that we translate into.
You mentioned about the search engine, 25% of malware. So why instead of downloading it and then breaking the problem, why don't you do it with, let's say, I do Google search. If it gives 25% of malware,
It does. So I said the URL classification is all marking up the URLs to tell the user that it is safe or not. So URL classification is already doing at the search engine results level. Then the Norton DNS product is doing it at the domain level.
But all you are doing it locally in
No. On the browser, in the browser. Well, I mean, we are not Google, right? So we cannot prevent the search result from showing up into the search result. What we can do is we can mark up the URLs which show up in the search result, and we can block the user from going to the search page, right? I mean, Google does. Google has safe search, so they automatically are cleaning up their search results and not showing search results which are about infected sites. But still, a lot of it goes through because the attacks are very regional. They might be attack campaign or threat campaign might be very specific to, for example, Singapore or Boston attacks and so on and so forth, where the scan is going on only in that geolocation. And so, okay, I'm going to go from here to there. All right.
So we thought of putting these things on Kaggle and basically having the community in general trying to contribute.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
look at encryption. I mean, like algorithms have to be public, right? I mean, otherwise this will affect.
yes, we have thought. Guess we're just slow. We haven't done it. We'll do it.
Are you worried about the people that are trying to commit these frauds against you learning about your data set?
That is always a concern. I think this field has got basically that is the crux of the problem. It's not so much about me disclosing an IP or giving an advantage to some other vendor. It's more about me standing here and talking about something which the manager also then realize, oh, that's what I do. I just have to modify this, and there you go, it erased. Right? And it's a much harder, as I said, they have to get it right once. We have to get it right all the time.
But that's why I gave you the encryption example. Is like once it's out there, it's kind of tested out. It becomes the problem starts to kind of go down by itself. I mean, it becomes harder and harder for these guys to do that. Today you are doing it with limited resources. You have the bigger community trying to help you out before this.
I guess we never felt that way, that we are limited in terms of resources. We never felt the need. As I said, domain expertise is really, we're not looking for machine learning only, right? We're looking for machine learning plus malware analysts. That combination, to be honest, Kaggle is not the right avenue for hunting for that combination. Maybe it is, we'll try, just wasn't worth it right so far.
What percentage of your solutions or characterizations are obtained from NIST? Where there is a federal research that's done and to indicate what the problems are and what the solutions are.
So we do have a government research division which collaborates with NIST, and there we are just looking at research to help improve our technology. We are not really doing a whole lot in combination with NIST or with NIST. It really is a completely separate, separate group within the company which is doing government research. Part of it does, I mean, if we figure out some interesting technique, it might make its way to production.
But you're not saying that they provide a lot of input for you in terms of figuring out categorizing, labeling, good, bad, ugly?
No, not really.
So this crowdsourcing which you mentioned, it's more the population of different machines rather than actually any active participation of people trying to tell you whether something is safe or not.
I don't think so. We want to engage the user. As I said, bad idea. Right. He is very motivated to see that video. He's going to say yes to everything. Yeah.
So you mentioned a few supervised learning methods, and you also mentioned the clustering. What are the clustering algorithms? Just mention what are the clustering methodologies you use?
Sorry, I trained on that.
So you mentioned SVM decision tree. So
I said all of them are candidate classifiers that we use.
Uh-huh.
I didn't call out exactly which one do we use or which one we don't use.
What are the candidate clustering algorithms that you have?
The space is so limited. Sorry. Yes.
Are there any competitors that are doing something similar?
I'm sure. This is. I didn't say that we are the only ones in the industry who are doing this. I said I don't know what others are doing. I'm pretty sure others are doing the same thing or similar things. This is not rocket science. I mean, this has been going on for 10 years. And we used machine learning for a long time. I mean, I think we were like in 2000 we were using machine learning in our antivirus engines. Just that because you're a big old vendor, people tend to think that hey, you know what, Symantec is probably not doing all these smart things, but that's not true. We've been doing this for a while. Just that that we don't feel compelled to go out and talk about look, this is what stuff you're doing. It doesn't really get us anything more. In fact, we are concerned because of the large user population that we have. So look, if you have a small vendor, a startup, they will be very excited to go about talking about what cool technology they have, right? Because what do they want to lose, right? They don't have any user base, and if they have FPs, they have 10 users who are going to complain about FPs. right? If we have an FP, 100 million users are going to complain about, and my CEO is going to call me, and I'm going to be out of the door. So it's a completely different ballgame when it comes to addressing that large user population. Yes, please.
So we talked about a lot of file-based features. So for exploits that are for like a trusted binary, like a web browser,
Yeah.
where most of it would be behavioral in-memory kind of exploits, do the same techniques work well, or because it's kind of intermixed with the...
No, they do work well. They do work well. It's just your feature sets are different, right? I mean, feature sets could be in a buffer flow scenario. A feature set could be more about the prologue characteristics, epilogue characteristics, the call originated from page attributes and so on and so forth, code page and so on. And the different, I think it applies there also. But again, it works. But do we do it? No, because in those limited scenarios, this is not worth the effort. We are better off just writing a heuristic signature to detect an exploit in that case than trying to build a classifier. Right? Classifier it doesn't apply everywhere. You have to measure the classifier.
So you talked about phishing and scams, but you didn't talk too much about the virus thing. Is this kind of thing of the past, or is it still a sort of?
No, it is still. I mean, the difference is that previously signature-based approaches were effective enough at picking up malware. I mean, viruses. I put it in a generic term called malware because it's a huge class of things that go in that bucket. These days, it's more about polymorphic malware, where they're trying to make sure that you are the only one who's getting that unique version of the software or malware, so that, as I said, cryptors, they're employing cryptors and hackers to make sure that security software doesn't easily identify that piece of software as malware. They're in a business. They just won't try to malware and release it, only to realize that as soon as it hits the end user's machine, it's gone, and they're not being successful. So, yeah, malware definitely is. Yeah.
Question, or two questions on stability. One is on features and another is on models.
Yes.
So on features, when you do your feature engineering, you're evaluating your features based on like information theory or predictive things.
Yeah.
Do you also evaluate your features based on stability, kind of like hold out over time?
Absolutely.
How volatile things are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, whenever we introduce a new feature, it's a pretty common practice that we say, this is the data set with old features. This is the data set which has old and new features. Let's do a comparative analysis, how the new features are trying to fill in the gaps that we identified in the previous run of the machine learning and testing and release, and are the new set of features addressing a stability problem, or are they addressing an FP or FM problem, or what are they addressing? And we always have a long running list of features that we want to implement, and depending on what problems we are seeing in the field, if we are seeing a problem related to concept drift, then we'll go after features, implementing features which are more about stability of the model. If we are seeing FPs and FNs as a problem, then we'll go after feature sets which are more about handling the accuracy of the model. So it depends on the application and depends on what the existing classifier is doing in the field and what is the problem that we're trying to solve.
But then are there strategies like trying to keep very stable features interacting together in compound or volatile features? Or that it's just more based on what makes sense in the business?
Yeah. Not that we're trying to deliberately combine those type of features. That's
okay.
We don't
on the model stability, then, are you able to compartmentalize parts of the model where if you, rather than replacing the whole thing, the 6-month effort, maybe you can just take out this part of the model and update that, or this part of the model, Bayesian priors.
Yeah. So we do that in the background research, but we have never taken that step of doing it because it hasn't been worth. There was too much engineering cost involved in trying to pick pieces of the model and try to combine it. Our new models have almost always been better or on par, that it wasn't worth the effort of trying to combine elements of the previous model into the new model and so on.
Okay,
Can you talk a little bit about authors and the groups that build the malware? Do you find that you can trace back some specific handwriting styles or? Yeah,
there are always signatures and malware families which will be very specific to those families, those translated to features. Absence of that could indicate good, presence of that could indicate bad.
Is there a life cycle that, the typical malware vendor exists for next 5 years and then kind of falls down, or?
Oh, you mean like the malware campaign?
I'm talking about people who develop malware, they're criminals and
I haven't traced their lifetime to know whether they are engaging in different malware campaigns or not over a period of time, but I can imagine that this is a business, so they just switch from one campaign to the other campaign. It's a pretty lucrative business for them.
So on that same topic, you described a fairly elaborate infrastructure that you have here to protect against the malware. How big an infrastructure do you think the attackers have? I mean, it's very unbalanced because you have to protect 99% of the time and they only have to get through one. So what's sort of the magnitude of the effort that they're launching to attack you? And let's set aside the government initiated.
I think they also have, very, very mature and robust infrastructure. The cryptos and hackers that I briefly touched upon, I could probably talk for 2 hours about that. They employ things like online services, where they'll create a malware and submit it to an online service, which will tell that, hey, this security vendor is detecting it. They'll get a file back and they'll mutate it and submit it. In fact, you pay more fees, the infrastructure guy, he's going to say, okay, give me a piece of malware and I keep mutating it till I find a successful variant of it, which evades all the other security software, and it's going to cost you this much. It's a business. As I said, $500, 1 million users, it's a decent chunk of money to put for your next venture, next campaign that you want to launch. So it's a very well funded infrastructure, I would say. Yes, please.
As the whole world goes to the cloud, everything is cloud-based. Does malware in cloud have any special implications, or is it just the same for you?
Same for us. So, yeah. I mean, of course, there's a new infrastructure to attack, right? They have the cloud infrastructure to attack or propagate or break into an enterprise for that. But, the rest everything is
Have you found a need to make the models sort of sooner and sooner over the last many years? Is the velocity increasing, or are you making the models?
We are definitely applying machine learning to more and more problems. We come up with very, very innovative areas in which you can apply machine learning. With regards to whether we train and release classifiers more frequently, it again depends on the application.
Well, what I'm asking is whether the malware guys are getting cleverer faster and faster, or are they going at the same velocity?
They are going as fast as they can, make as much money as they can.
So I guess this is another iteration of that same question, is looking at percentages of, say, good email, vice email with some kind of infection.
Yeah.
Is that percentage going up, or what are those percentages?
Oh, okay.
like?
So we'll make good file versus bad files, or of course the bad file population is increasing at a much faster pace, because if you were to count one file by its hash, then they are, in case of a polymorphic malware, every user is getting a completely new file, right? So in that regards, file population of malware is definitely growing at a much faster pace than good software, right? So yeah, population growth of malware is a leaps and bounds more than good software.
So can you apply machine learning for detecting APT public data?
Yeah, I mean,
Can
so
you
we
repeat
did
the question?
deliberate. Do you apply machine learning to detect APTs, right? So APT and targeted attacks are an interesting problem, because from a percentage representation of the entire malware space, they are so small, right, that they don't really get picked up by a classifier. But then we employ the reputation technology, which, as I said, is very, very effective at finding patterns in low representation threat spaces. And it has been extremely effective at, so we, as many APT studies as we conduct in-house, we have conducted, and we were proactively convicting and detecting those pieces of malware. Not in all cases, because they employ very clever techniques too. But wherever we were in play, our detection rates were very, very decent.
I mean, when you talk about the APT, you You are talking about, let's say, somebody attacking the enterprise
Yeah.
IP, right?
Yeah, well,
Now, how
they're
could
targeting an enterprise.
Yeah, how could we possibly be collecting the behavior if you?
No, we're not collecting the behavior. What we're saying is, if we, say for example, we are protecting an enterprise A, it was a target of an APT, then if it was a new file or a new piece of malware, and it was downloaded on the machine, and it went through various layers of defense in our product was making decisions, right? And we are getting anonymized metadata information submitted back. So we know what was the prediction our classifiers are making on the endpoint for those pieces of software. And in almost all cases that we have analyzed, I wouldn't say 100%, but almost all cases, we were pretty right on in convicting those pieces of malware. So we don't have the file, we don't know what the file is, but the telemetry is telling us that when we encountered those pieces of software, we did go about convicting them.
But how do you think you deal with the zero-day attacks and when the new vulnerabilities that come across and you may not know the features that are
Well, the vulnerability might be new, but the malware will employ almost all the same techniques, right? It has to come on a machine, it has to execute, it has to download more components, it has to register to the operating system, it has to exfiltrate data. I mean, in terms of the malware, what it does, that doesn't change that much. How it comes on the machine, yes, that changes. You might suddenly have a new vulnerability in Java, so now they figure out a new way to come out to your machine, but behaviorally, the malware doesn't really change that much. I mean, it does change, but in terms of zero-day attacks, if you're talking about zero-day vulnerability, you're not talking about a completely new threat. I mean, that happens, but that doesn't happen as frequently as you would imagine.
When that happens, then are you detecting it or you just have to?
No, so as I said, there are so many layers I talked about, right? There was URL, there was file, there was behavior, there was network. In cases where one particular technology is not effective, the collaboration effect does give us a pretty robust protection against completely new threats. And you know, as I explained, we are constantly monitoring the error rates in the back end. If we suddenly see a new threat family which is still evading all these layers, we turn around and release either a new classifier or a new signature or a new heuristic in order to detect that. And then we go about coming up with more robust models for that. From knowing that there was an FN to, if we know that there is an FN, we turn around a signature, and I mean, in terms of enterprises, we have SLAs to turn around within an hour.
Not the signature, but
no, the heuristic signature, right? Not the definition, not a fingerprint, not 1:1, 1:many signature. Definition, I should refrain from the word signature because it implies a short use.